come from a background of development. So I started working professionally in development in the 70s and right through to when I did my permaculture course in the 80s. Then I realized that permaculture was a much, much better field for development because it's integrated and systems approach and because you hand people useful knowledge and they can run with it. So it was just common sense. And from then on, I've been invited to work in permaculture in many countries of the world, and then developed a conviction that it should be taken to people who don't have access to it otherwise. They don't have the web, they don't have the language. Poverty or displacement or something has ruled them out of access to permaculture. It seemed to me almost a human rights issue and certainly a gross injustice that poverty or displacement would cause people not to be able to access permaculture. So I've chosen to work in those countries where the access for ordinary people is limited and where you can get maximum impact. And pretty soon I decided that was war and civil war. So Cambodia through the Khmer Rouge and the landmines and the blowing up bridges and the burning of houses and the very, very sad days of Cambodia. And then, of course, just at the end of the Hodgkin routine in Albania, then AIDS epidemic in Uganda, East Timor with war, refugees years ago from Vietnam in Hong Kong, refugees years ago from Myanmar in Thailand, Afghanistan, Iraq. So this is places that people can't access permaculture, and trying to put it on a sustainable basis is pretty hard, but you learn a lot doing it. You make a lot of mistakes. You learn a lot more. So that's just a quick background. And the Permaculture for Refugees came out of a conviction that the permaculture camps that exist are immoral, unconscionable, that to be a refugee is one of the greatest world injustices, that ordinary, decent and non-decent people should be displaced. Homelessness is a terrible thing, so is uncertainty. So that was a place for permaculture. So with a few other people, 5 others, we got together. Sarah's one of them and said, let's develop permaculture for refugees. So that took us up to the start of doing something.
Can you share about what P4R and your work has done so far in the different parts of the world with refugees and in the context of resettlements and how it can be a good response?
So what's happened there was we decided we needed the evidence. And having met up with Boniface Gomez and Sarah again in India last year before, we said, could we have some permaculture teaching in the refugee camp at Cox's Bazar for Rohingya? And then Bonnie Claire put me in touch with Syrian Refugee Women's Project in Turkey, then the transitional camp, one of the worst in the world in Lesbos, Greece, then a longer term camp in Attica, and finally in Malaysia, where there are more Myanmar refugees. But Myanmar has 400,000 refugees, and our next bit of work is to work with Sarah and learn from her about displaced people from war, earthquakes, cyclones and floods, and recently volcanoes in Philippines, and see the effectiveness of permaculture. So we got fairly small funding, but it was enough to do that. Teachers gave their time free.
So it would be great to have the practical, like what the refugees learn and how they can apply it also on the ground.
Well, the goal is just a little one, to transform all refugee camps into ecological villages of some sort, because that's good for the present and good for the future. I couldn't see any disadvantages in that goal. However, getting there is a process. So although it is about teaching refugees, we needed to know that permaculture in camps and settlements would work. So what we did was teach a PDC, and I'm now convinced it's what we must be teaching, because the rest of it is gardening. And so many refugees move on. They may go home, they may go forward, but they need to carry as much as they can of the whole syllabus. And so, although it's for refugees, it's transformative. So the design of the course was, if you have 30 people, 2/3 would be refugees. 1/3 would be your local hosting NGO, like Green ReLeaf, yours, Sarah. In this case, it was BASD or others. A couple of teachers who we hoped for experience and could get the experience of teaching in a camp, because it is different, and some local people, which makes a huge difference, more than I ever knew, and refugees. So really there are 4 groups of people who are doing the PDC together, and I found it was very important. So just briefly, to have locals in the course with refugees gives continuity afterwards. Refugees get invited to local people's homes. Local people work with them. They learn bits of language, and the projects go on. For teaching, the host NGO, which is usually a national or a local NGO, absolutely critical, because we leave them with the skills. For the co-teachers, about 50% would be able to go on and teach well, but they still have to have the skill of running a PDC from beginning to end, with all the organising and chaos involved in that, and possibly find their own funds. And then there are the refugees. And strangely enough, in our outcomes report that I'm just finishing now, the impact on the local NGO, which may be an INGO, an NGO, a little NGO, is absolutely critical to follow up and implementation of permaculture in camps and in settlements. It's fundamental. If they haven't got it, the project will die. So we don't actually know how many refugees planted a vegetable garden or cleaned water or put in a tree or did a windbreak or put woolen blanket insulation in their housing. But we do know the impact on the local area. We know the upscaling, and we know how many people it passes, and we know what makes it move fast through the community. It's to do with the local NGO and its monitoring. So, people say to me, how many refugees put in gardens? Well, altogether, there's probably about 4,000 refugees were affected by it. More than 200 people learnt permaculture. Probably about 4,000 refugees received information in different places and times. But we know the impact on the camps and settlements more than we know what one individual did, even though we've got some good case studies. So that is rather interesting, because I think the natural thing is to say, how many refugees did this? But I'm very satisfied with this result. I do think there are special things about our teaching and where teaching has to be modified. And I retain the absolute conviction you don't have to dumb down, you have to change your teaching methods to get sometimes concepts across when you've got 3 or 4 languages in a class and the interpreter's not quite up to it. You have to change your teaching methods, but you don't have to change the context.
That was my next question, actually, like how can practitioners like us learn more how to apply the experiences and methods that you have built together over the years?
Look, there's no real shortcut to it, because we take it through the preparation, to what we dropped out of the syllabus, to different teaching methods that we brought in, especially when you're losing time with interpreters. Because there is a tendency for teachers to continue speaking in their own language and forget the interpreter. And if you've got 2 or 3 languages, then the students don't follow your language or the other interpreter's language, and you can see them getting bored and tired, but still polite. So you really have to do something dramatically different. Okay, and often you don't have electricity, so it's not just a case of running a series of videos and saying, look at this, look at this.
We are also curious from our parts of the world. how permaculture can be applied with the bushfires, or how you're responding?
I think, Sarah, we have to develop some principles around disaster, and we can't go on doing what we've done before. Building the sorts of houses we built and farming the way we farmed is not going to work in the future. I think we might have to do what Greece and Portugal have done. So after the fires in Greece, they stopped planting pine trees, and they're going to make permaculture villages instead, which are greener and wetter and more productive than the small farmlets in pine forests. In Portugal, where they lost so many of their fires, they are turning away from eucalyptus, and rightfully so, for their forests, because they're the world producers of toilet paper. They're looking for timbers for a national thing, and there is some dissension between the forestry department and people who want to go back to oaks or pork and the oak forests that are traditional in that area. Here in Australia, I think we have to learn a lot more about appropriate clearing, because people have cleared so much now. You can see huge masses of topsoil washing away with the heavy rain. So you've just lost the topsoil, and then you've burnt out everything else. So Australians have got a huge learning curve. I think we're going to have to look at what our limiting factors are. We're going to have to work smaller scale, and we're going to have to learn a lot more about how and what is happening in our forests. We've got sulphur cockatoos here, and they screech all the time. It's not me or anyone else screeching, it's the birds.